You can't pee on her roses. Toby, she's injured, not blind. Yaron Hale muttered as he yanked gently on the leash, trying to guide his 6-year-old son's golden retriever away from the perfectly trimmed flower bed. Toby let out a snort, tail wagging like the world was his playground. Yaron sighed and rubbed the back of his neck, glancing back at the brownstone's front door. He still wasn't sure how the hell he'd ended up walking a stranger's dog in the middle of Brooklyn. But here he was jobless for 2 months, barely scraping rent, and trying to convince a dog he didn't own to act civilized. The door opened, and there she was. Gwen Sutter, the woman he'd nearly run over with his grocery cart 3 days ago. She'd been limping, balancing a coffee in one hand and wincing with every step. He'd offered to help her carry her bags, and then somehow he still didn't know how he'd agreed to walk her dog until her sprained ankle healed. And now, here she was, leaning on crutches, wearing a faded hoodie and leggings, her dark curls pulled into a messy bun. "You're early," she said with a small smile. "Toby likes you, he usually growls at strangers." Yaron gave a half smile. "I'm not a stranger anymore, this is day 4, I think we're officially dog walker and dog," she laughed. It was soft, a little surprised, like she wasn't used to laughing around people. "I brought him back early today," Yaron added. "I've got to pick up my kid from school." Her eyes lit up. "You have a kid?" "Yeah, Taryn, he's 6. Smart, stubborn, way too good at negotiating bedtime." She smiled again, wider this time, and leaned on one crutch as Toby bounded up the steps toward her. "Well, thank you. Again, I owe you." "You don't," Yaron said, suddenly uncomfortable. "Really?" "I needed fresh air anyway." She tilted her head. "Still, would you let me buy you coffee sometime, as a thank you?" He hesitated. Not because he didn't want to God, he did, but because there was something about her. Calm, quiet, but guarded. And something told him she wasn't just some girl who happened to live in a brownstone worth more than his entire life savings. He scratched his jaw. "Sure, coffee sounds nice," she grinned. "Tomorrow, same time," he nodded. "I'll bring Toby back around 11. As he walked down the steps, he couldn't help glancing back. Gwen was still standing there, watching him with something unreadable in her eyes. The next day, coffee turned into an hour-long conversation on the steps of her stoop. And the day after that, she invited him in. The place was warm, bright, and smelled faintly of cinnamon. Nothing about it screamed millionaire, no gold-plated anything. Just cozy furniture, a wall full of books, and a giant painting of a forest hanging above the fireplace. Toby flopped onto the floor and fell asleep immediately. "You sure he's not 90? Yaron joked. Gwen laughed and handed him a cup of coffee. "He's just lazy, I respect it." "You work from home?" he asked, nodding toward the laptop on the coffee table. "Something like that." He raised an eyebrow. She sipped her coffee. "I run a company, mostly investment stuff." She shrugged like it wasn't a big deal. Yaron blinked. "Like stocks, among other things." He didn't press. He didn't want to look like he was fishing, and honestly, he didn't care. She was funny, sharp, and had this way of looking at him like she saw past the crumbling edges. And after a week of morning walks and conversations that got deeper and more personal every day, he found himself thinking about her even when he was cooking dinner for Taryn or folding laundry or applying to jobs he knew he wouldn't get. It was stupid. She was clearly out of his league. She had a brownstone and silk curtains. He had a leaky sink and overdue bills, but then she asked if he wanted to stay for lunch, and he did. "Dad, you've got a girlfriend," Taryn accused one night, squinting suspiciously over his bowl of mac and cheese. Yaron choked on his water. "What? No." "I do not. You walk her dog, you talk about her." "I walk her dog because her legs hurt. She's pretty." Yaron blinked. "Okay, you're grounded." Taryn grinned, victorious. Later that night, after Taryn had gone to bed, Yaron stood by the window, staring out at the city lights and wondering when the hell it had happened when a woman with a crutch and a lazy dog had started living in his head rent-free. He saw her nearly every day now. They'd shared takeout on her couch, argued over movies, and laughed more times than he could count. But he still didn't know where the line was. She was warm, generous, but always a little distant, like there was something she was holding back. And he couldn't afford to fall for someone who had one foot out the door, except he already had. The next week, Gwen invited him and Taryn over for dinner. He tried to say no, his pride screamed at him, but Gwen insisted. Taryn was on his best behavior, charming as always, and Gwen was different, softer. Like she wasn't just hosting, like she wanted them there. When Taryn fell asleep on her couch, curled up with Toby, Yaron stood in the kitchen, helping her put dishes away. "You're really good with him," he said, watching her tuck a blanket around his son. "I like him. He's sweet and smart. You've done a good job." He looked at her, unsure what to say. She glanced up. "I like having you here." "Gwen, I know I've been quiet about some things," she said, voice low, "but I'm not hiding anything bad. I'm just not used to letting people in. Especially not like this." He stepped closer. "Like this how?" Her eyes met his. "Like you." His heart beat faster. "You don't have to tell me everything right now. But I'm not here for anything you're not ready to give." She looked at him for a long moment, then reached up and touched his cheek gently. "I want to give it, I just don't want to scare you away. You couldn't if you tried." And then, finally, she kissed him. It was warm and slow and real. No games, no noise. Just her lips on his and the quiet certainty that his life had just changed. Later that night, as he carried a sleepy Taryn home, Gwen stood at her doorway, watching them. She smiled to herself, hand pressed lightly to her chest. She hadn't meant to fall in love. But she had, and he had no idea just how much she had to give. "You're not cutting the crust off," Taryn said from the kitchen table, eyeing the sandwich like it had personally betrayed him. Yaron glanced over his shoulder from the stove. "You're 6, not royalty." "Eat it." Taryn sighed like a man burdened by the weight of the world and took a bite anyway. The dingy apartment smelled faintly of burnt toast, and the morning sun filtered through a crooked slat of the blinds. Yaron flipped the pancake he was making, thinking about the night before. About Gwen's kiss. About the way her fingers had lingered on his wrist afterward, like she didn't want to let go. It had been years since anyone looked at him like that. He boxed up the pancakes, made sure Taryn's backpack was zipped, and walked him to school. On the way back, the city buzzed around him, horns, sirens, the faint music of some street performer echoing down the block, but all he could think about was her. He had no business falling for someone like Gwen. Not when his savings account barely had enough for groceries, and he was still getting rejection emails from jobs he was overqualified for. He walked straight to her place, knocked once, and waited. She opened the door in a slate blue blouse and jeans, one crutch still tucked under her arm. Her curls were down today, tumbling around her shoulders, and she looked like she hadn't slept much. "I was hoping you'd come," she said, stepping aside. He hesitated for half a second before walking in. "I couldn't stop thinking about you." She shut the door behind him and leaned against it. "Me either." He reached for her hand and she let him take it. "I need to tell you something," she said, voice steady but quiet. Yaron tensed. She led him to the couch, sat down beside him, and pulled her legs up carefully. "My last relationship ended badly, not in a dramatic way, just empty. I stopped trusting people after that, especially when they knew who I was." He frowned. "What do you mean who you were?" She looked him dead in the eye. "I own Hale and Easton." His breath caught. "That's your firm?" he asked slowly, his brain trying to catch up. "That's one of the biggest investment companies in the Northeast. Second largest," she said, her mouth lifting slightly. "My father started it. I took over 6 years ago." Yaron leaned back, trying to absorb it. He'd heard of Hale and Easton, everyone had. They were behind half of the city's most profitable real estate developments, and she was the face behind all of it. He ran a hand through his hair. "You're a CEO. Technically, yes. So when you said you run a company." "I meant it literally." He stared at her, still trying to connect the woman who made grilled cheese with a slice of apple in the middle to the one who probably had a building named after her. "I didn't tell you earlier because I needed to know if you'd still be you." He blinked at her. "What does that mean? You're real, Yaron. You don't ask for anything, you show up, you listen. You're not impressed by money and you don't want anything from me except me." "Yeah, because you're funny and smart and you actually laugh at my bad jokes." She didn't laugh then. She looked at him like she was trying to memorize the way he sat, elbows on knees, eyes cautious but honest. "I've had people treat me like an investment," she said. "Even people I thought loved me." He reached out and took both her hands in his. "I don't care about your company. I care that you stayed up with Taryn when he got scared from a thunderstorm. I care that you remember how I take my coffee and that you let me talk about my mom without changing the subject." Her eyes went glassy. "You're not even a little intimidated. I'm a single dad who once fixed a leaky pipe with duct tape and a spoon. I'm way past pride." She laughed then, the sound thick with something deeper. "I want this," he said. "Whatever this is, I want it. But I need you to believe I'm not going anywhere." She didn't answer right away. Just leaned in, rested her forehead against his, and breathed him in. "I believe you." He kissed her again, slower this time, like they had all the time in the world. That afternoon, Gwen offered to pick Taryn up from school. Yaron hesitated. He'd never let anyone else do that before, but Taryn adored her, and she was the first person in years he actually trusted. He waited near the window like a nervous teenager until he saw her and Taryn walking down the block, Toby trailing behind them. Taryn was eating a popsicle, talking Gwen's ear off about a science experiment gone wrong. When they came in, Gwen handed Yaron a folded piece of paper. "What's this?" he asked. "Something you need to see." He opened it. It was a job offer at Hale & Easton, operations manager, full salary, full benefits. "I didn't ask for this," he said, trying to hand it back. "I know, but I need someone I can trust, and I've seen how you manage chaos." "You do it every day." He looked at her torn. "I don't want a handout. It's not. It's a job, one you're more than qualified for. You can take it or not, but don't say no because of pride." Taryn poked his head into the room. "Can we have tacos tonight?" Yaron looked at his son, then back at Gwen, then the paper in his hand. "Yeah," he said, voice low. "Yeah, we can have tacos." He folded the offer and slipped it into his pocket. He wasn't ready to call it a miracle, but it sure felt like one. Yaron hadn't worn a suit in years. The one he put on that Monday morning had been tucked in the back of his closet since his sister's wedding. It was tighter across the shoulders now, and the cuffs had a faint fray at the hem, but it would have to do. He stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the knot of his tie while Taryn sat on the edge of the bed, swinging his feet. "You look like a lawyer," Taryn said, chewing on a piece of toast. "I look like someone pretending to be a lawyer," Yaron muttered. "You're gonna be awesome." Yaron turned, ruffling his son's hair. "Thanks, buddy." He dropped Taryn off at Gwen's place. She had insisted on watching him for the day and arrived at the Hale & Easton building with 15 minutes to spare. Standing in the elevator felt like stepping into another world. Polished marble floors, brushed gold paneling, and a digital screen that welcomed employees by name. When the doors opened on the 20th floor, he stepped into a space that looked more like a luxury showroom than an office. A woman with a headset approached him, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Hale, right this way." He followed her through a sleek hallway lined with frosted glass walls and minimalist artwork. She stopped in front of an office with a floor-to-ceiling view of the city and gestured him inside. Gwen was already there. She wore a navy blazer over a cream blouse, her boot gone now, replaced by a pair of low heels. Her posture was straighter, sharper, like she'd stepped into her skin fully. When she looked up, though, her expression softened. "You made it," she said. Still not sure how. She stood and crossed to him, her tone shifting. "Officially, you report to my COO, but if you ever feel like you're in too deep, you come to me." "Always. Are you sure you want me here? I wouldn't have offered you the job if I wasn't. I just don't want people thinking you hired me because she held up a hand. This company doesn't run on favors. You're here because you earned it. And because I trust you more than anyone in that boardroom." He exhaled, tension easing from his shoulders. "All right, then. Let's do this." By the end of the day, his head was spinning from onboarding presentations, departmental briefings, and a tour that included a cafe with an espresso machine worth more than his car. He caught on fast. Years of juggling fatherhood and freelance jobs had made him adaptive, but still, the scale of it all left him reeling. He picked up Taryn from Gwen's at 6, and she surprised them both by inviting them to a rooftop dinner. "Thought we'd celebrate your first day," she said, holding open the door that led to the building's private terrace. The view took his breath away. Twinkling lights stretched across the skyline, and a small table had been set beneath a string of warm bulbs. There were candles, silverware that gleamed like it had never been used, and plates already waiting with grilled sea bass and roasted vegetables. Taryn's eyes widened. "Is this what rich people eat every night?" Gwen laughed. "Only on Mondays." Yaron helped Taryn into a seat. "You didn't have to do all this. I wanted to. The meal was delicious, and Taryn was unusually quiet, caught up in the view, and the dessert that followed, a chocolate souffle with whipped cream, he declared the best thing he'd ever tasted. Afterward, Gwen handed Yaron a folded envelope. He opened it and froze. Inside was a check, not for a bonus, not for some symbolic amount, but enough to pay off every debt he'd been carrying since Taryn was born. "I can't take this," he said, voice low. "You don't have to," she replied, "but I want you to know it's there. No strings attached. I don't want to be a man who needs saving." "You're not," she said. "You're a man who deserves a break." He looked at her across the candlelight, his jaw tight, his heart louder than it should have been. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I've never met anyone who sees me as just Gwen, not the name, not the legacy, just me. I never wanted anything else." She reached across the table, her hand wrapping around his. "Then let me do this. Let me be the one who shows up for you too." He looked down at their hands, then at Taryn, who was lying back in his chair, half asleep and full of sugar. "This doesn't scare you?" he asked. "I've led meetings with oil magnates and out-negotiated 4 Fortune 500 CEOs, she said. "You think a 6-year-old with jam on his shirt scares me?" Yaron laughed. The sound pulled from somewhere deeper than it had been in years. That night, after they'd returned home and Taryn was tucked into bed, Yaron sat on the edge of his mattress, staring at the envelope. He didn't need the money to fall for her. He already had. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had something to offer back. The next morning, he showed up at her office before the workday started. She looked up from her desk, surprised. "Everything okay?" He walked in, closed the door behind him, and crossed the room. "I didn't come here for a handout," he said, "I know. But I'm not going to let my pride stop me from building something with you, not anymore." She stood, her expression unreadable. "I want to earn this job." "I want to earn you." She stepped closer. "You already have." He kissed her again, this time not out of surprise or impulse, but because it was exactly what he wanted. When they broke apart, he whispered, "No more pretending I don't belong here." Her voice was soft. "You do." And for the first time in years, he believed it. Gwen stood at the edge of the ballroom, her fingers resting lightly on the stem of a champagne flute she hadn't sipped from in over 20 minutes. The annual Hale and Easton Foundation Gala was in full swing. Strings of light glittered above the 100-foot ceiling, crystal chandeliers sparkled like starlight, and every guest in the room had a net worth that could buy a private island. Waiters in black vests glided through the crowd with trays of caviar and imported wine, and somewhere near the stage, a jazz quartet played a song she couldn't quite focus on. She hated these events. But tonight was different. This time, she hadn't come alone. Yaron stood across the room, deep in conversation with one of her board members, his tailored navy suit making him look every inch the man she already knew he was. He was listening intently, nodding occasionally, one hand resting casually in his pocket. He didn't seem out of place. In fact, he looked like he belonged here more than any of them. She caught his eye. He excused himself with a smile and made his way toward her, weaving through the crowd with quiet confidence. When he reached her, he leaned in just slightly. "You look like you're counting the minutes until you can escape." "I've already counted them twice," she said, lips curving faintly. He glanced around. "You want to get out of here?" "I can't. I'm presenting the scholarship fund update in 20 minutes. He raised an eyebrow. "You didn't tell me you were expanding the fund." "I didn't want to jinx it. We're doubling the number of full-ride scholarships next year. Most of them will go to young parents." He blinked. "Seriously," she nodded. "Turns out, investing in people who have something to fight for is good business." He stepped closer. "You're incredible, you know that. Don't say that too loud." "Someone might expect me to start smiling at board meetings." He chuckled and took her free hand, brushing his thumb across her knuckles. "You need me down there with you." She glanced toward the stage. "Honestly?" "Yeah." He led her toward the podium just as the MC called her name. As she began to speak, Yaron stood just off to the side, his presence steady and grounding. She talked about opportunity, risk, and the power of second chances. About people who had been overlooked, underestimated, and what happened when someone finally believed in them. When she finished, the applause was genuine, not polite, not obligatory. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed toward the dining area, Yaron turned to her. You didn't mention you were going to quote me. She looked at him. You're the one who said people don't need perfect conditions to thrive. Just someone to bet on them. I said that after fixing a broken printer with a fork and duct tape, and it was true. Behind them, a photographer asked to take their picture. Gwen hesitated. Yaron didn't. He pulled her close, his arm wrapping around her waist like it had always belonged there. The flash popped. People glanced over. Several guests clearly recognized her. But for once, she didn't care. She wasn't hiding anymore. Later that night, they returned to her brownstone. Taryn had stayed with her housekeeper's granddaughter, and when they stepped inside, the familiar sounds of the city filtered through the windows. Gwen kicked off her heels and sank onto the couch, exhaling like she'd been holding her breath since the gala began. Yaron sat beside her, loosening his tie. I didn't mean to become part of your world, he said quietly. She turned her head toward him. You didn't. I built space for you in it. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a small square box. Her eyes briefly widened. He opened it. Inside, nestled in black velvet, was a ring, simple, elegant. A single diamond set in platinum, no flourish, no excess, just honest, quiet beauty. She stared at it, speechless. I didn't grow up with much, he said. And I never thought I'd find someone who made me feel like I wasn't less because of it. You changed that. You changed everything. She looked up at him, eyes already brimming. I don't have a yacht or a villa in the south of France. But I've got a 6-year-old who adores you, a heart that's never been more certain of anything, and a life I want to build with you. Every damn day. Her lips trembled. I'm not asking for a perfect story, he said. Just one we write together. She nodded once, then again, more fiercely, and threw her arms around his neck. Yes, she whispered. Yes, absolutely yes. He kissed her, and it felt like the answer to every question he'd ever asked in the dark. When she pulled back, breathless, she rested her forehead against his. You didn't even get down on one knee. I didn't think you'd want to make space with the coffee table. She laughed, unsteady and full of joy. In the weeks that followed, things moved fast but without chaos. Taryn adjusted easily. He called Gwen his not mom but kind of mom, and insisted on helping her pick flower arrangements for the wedding. Gwen's board was shocked by the engagement, but only for a moment. Once they met Yaron, they understood. He wasn't just a man who loved her. He was a man who saw her. The wedding was small, intimate, held on a rooftop with fairy lights and a soft breeze. Gwen wore a silk dress that caught the wind like water. Yaron wore a suit that fit him better than any before. And Taryn stood between them, holding the rings with a grin that nearly split his face. When they kissed, the city hummed around them, but for once it felt quiet, whole. Later that night, Gwen sat on the balcony of their new home, a place they'd found together, not hers or his, but theirs, and watched as Yaron danced with Taryn in the living room, both of them laughing over some ridiculous move they'd invented. She leaned her head back against the chair and let the moment settle deep into her chest. She had fallen in love without meaning to. He had walked into her life with a leash in one hand and no expectations in the other, and now, everything she'd ever built suddenly had a heart at its center. A home, a family, and a love she knew would never ask her to be anything but herself. The first morning of their new life together began not with fanfare, but with the soft clatter of a wooden toy falling to the floor, and the sound of Taryn's voice drifted through the cracked bedroom door. Dad. Gwen, I made breakfast. Sort of. Yaron sat up, blinking against the sunlight streaming through the windows. Gwen stirred beside him, her eyes still closed, but a lazy smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Is that smoke? She murmured. Yaron sniffed. Hopefully just toast. They found Taryn in the kitchen, standing proudly beside a tray that held 2 pieces of slightly burned toast with jelly, a cup of juice, and a flower plucked from the windowsill planter. Toby wagged his tail beside him, clearly hoping his efforts would result in table scraps. I didn't use the stove, Taryn said. Except a little. I used the thing with the knobs, but I wore oven mitts. Gwen crouched down, brushing his hair back. This is the best breakfast I've ever had. Yaron nodded solemnly. We'll eat it even if it kills us. They sat around the breakfast bar together, Gwen balancing her toast on her knee while Taryn told them about a comic book he wanted to write. There was no rush, no pressure. Just the quiet kind of morning that only happens when no one needs to be anywhere else. Later that week, they took their first trip as a family. Not to a private island or five-star resort, but to a quiet cottage upstate, nestled near a lake surrounded by pine trees. Gwen had found it through a friend, and the moment they pulled up the gravel drive and saw the water shimmer in the distance, she knew it was exactly what they needed. Taran ran toward the dock barefoot, his laughter echoing off the water, while Toby bounded after him. Yaron wrapped his arm around Gwen's shoulder. "You're sure you're okay being this far from cell reception?" She leaned into him. "I want to be somewhere where no one expects anything from me, except maybe s'mores. I can live with that." That night, they sat around a fire pit, wrapped in blankets, marshmallows roasting on skewers while the sun dipped low behind the trees. Taran fell asleep curled up in one of the Adirondack chairs. Toby snuggled at his feet. Yaron looked into the fire. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't met?" "No," Gwen said, resting her cheek against his shoulder. "Because I did meet you. And I don't want to waste a second wondering about a world where I didn't." He let her words settle, then kissed her hair. "You make it easy to believe in something again." "I used to think love was about timing or compatibility," she said. "But I think it's about showing up and staying. Even when it's hard. I'm not going anywhere, I know." Back in the city, life didn't slow down, but they moved through it differently now. The apartment they'd chosen together was filled with mismatched furniture, family photos, and the sound of piano keys. Taran had started lessons through a program Gwen quietly sponsored, though she never mentioned it. Every Friday night became their tradition. Takeout on the floor, board games, and one new movie carefully chosen by Taran, who took his role as director of family entertainment very seriously. One evening, Gwen came home late after a board meeting, heels in hand, her hair windblown from the sudden rainstorm. She stepped into the living room to find Yaron asleep on the couch, an open book on his chest, and Taran using his legs as a pillow, both of them completely out. She stood there for a moment, still in the doorway, her heart so full it ached. The woman who once ran empires without breaking stride now found her greatest joy in a sleepy boy, an ex-freelancer with a crooked smile and burnt toast on a Tuesday morning. Months passed, and with them came a rhythm she hadn't realized she was craving. She didn't need to prove anything anymore. Not to her board, not to the world, and not to herself. One afternoon, Yaron surprised her at the office. She hadn't seen him all day. He'd taken the morning off to meet with Taran's teacher, but now he stood in her doorway, holding a small box. She tilted her head. "What's that?" He stepped in. "Open it." Inside was a compass, a real one, brass, vintage, the kind sailors might have used a century ago. She lifted it gently. "It's beautiful. I found it at a flea market. Thought it was fitting. Because I always know where I'm going, because you helped me find where I was supposed to be." She closed the box carefully. "You're getting good at this." "At what?" "Making me cry in boardrooms." He stepped closer. "We've built something. Not just a life, but a family, and it's messy and loud and full of burnt toast, but it's ours." She smiled up at him. "Let's never stop building it." "I won't if you won't." She kissed him, there in the doorway of the office that once defined her. But now, it was just part of the whole, not the center. Years later, they would tell their story to friends who didn't quite believe it. About the dog, the sprained ankle, the job offer that changed everything. But what they didn't always say was that the real miracle wasn't in the first meeting. It was in every morning after, when Gwen and Yaron danced in the kitchen in their pajamas while coffee brewed. When Taran graduated and gave a speech that started with, "My dad taught me how to fix things, and my mom taught me how to build them." When they celebrated 20 years together on the same rooftop where they were married, surrounded by friends, family, and a life they'd built piece by piece. There were no more secrets, no more masks, just love, steady and fierce, and the quiet, extraordinary joy of knowing they had found something real and kept it forever.